very next part we're going to go into is actually looking into all the disability categories within IDEA. The first thing we need to look at is how IDEA looks at defining children with disabilities. And so a child with a disability per IDEA means a child evaluated in accordance to those numbers. There are very specific parts of the legislation, which is all the next slides. So don't worry, as having any of these listed IDEA category of disabilities. There are 13, and who by reason thereof needs special education and related services. So a child with disabilities or a child with a disability, according to IDEA, has to be in one of these 13 categories in order for them to be eligible to receive special education and related services. But it's not just you have to be in one of these categories. There's actually a number of things that happen within those categories, but that's important to know. So what we're going to do is look at each one of these disability categories, and I have them listed out in the slides by alphabetical order. This is literally just exactly how they're listed in the law. So, all right. And again, all of this language straight from the law. The only thing that I have added in some slides is a little asterisk at the bottom. Sometimes, most of the times, that asterisk is telling you that this disability category cannot be solely confirmed through the school. It must be confirmed by a medical professional or an expert in this area. And so that's what that little asterisk is. We are going to start with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. Sometimes you may also see it acronized as AUT, OT, but it all refers to autism spectrum disorder. Autism is a developmental disability that, according to IDEA, has to have significant impact affecting verbal and nonverbal communication and social interaction. So generally, it's evident before the age of 3, which is why those early intervention services are very important, because students are not yet in school by 3 years old, usually at least. And so if it's evident before age of 3 and we're able to provide that child and their family services, then by the time they get to school, they don't have to have this lag in services, and they may be more prepared and more successful if they've already been exposed to and given and used to receiving services to help them learn. Autism alone is not a reason for an individual to have a disability diagnosis per IDEA or to receive special education services. A diagnosis of autism within any child has to be significant enough to impact their learning, that without the use of services, and this applies to any disability category, without the use of services, the student will not learn, will not perform well, will not really do well within the school environment. But when given services, then they are able to access curriculum, education, spaces, so many other things. That is when a student is deemed to have a disability per IDEA. So I say that because autism, as in the name ASD, is a spectrum. We can see, or we can find youth or individuals who are at the low end of the spectrum, or I should say at one end of the spectrum, and have very significant and severe needs. They are engaging in stereotyping behaviors. They are a little bit more sensitive to sensory, to noises, they repetitive activities, they have communication needs, and many markers related to autism, and this is what sometimes most associate with autism. But then you may find an individual who is in the complete other side of the spectrum, or what we call high end of the spectrum. And they are usually the ones that are depicted in TV as having autism as freaky genius smart. That's not always the case. They are just functioning, would be the right word. How they are usually depicted in media is freaky genius smart with social issues. But this is the individual who may have markers of autism that are obvious to some, who may also have markers of autism that are not obvious to anybody, but it doesn't mean that they don't have it. This individual, if they are very functioning, very able to be within their world without the use of related services or just education services to function and do well in their academic sphere, then they are not likely going to receive services just because they have a diagnosis of autism. That service needs to be given to a student who is not able to access education without them. It's an interesting world. But autism is a spectrum. So a student who is at the high end of the scale, and even maybe completely functioning, if they have needs that are significant enough to need services, then they could feasibly get services. It's a whole system. Autism may be screened in schools, may be heavily suspected in schools. There are definitely tests that we can do in schools, but the diagnosis must be confirmed by a medical professional or somebody who is certified to diagnose autism. You may find a school psych who is trained in this world, or a psychometrician who just does the testing for disabilities in the school sector. It is often easier if a parent has their doctor diagnosed, because then we have medical proof, and that's just a lot easier to take than having to find other routes. And so that's usually the route that's recommended, because if a medical professional tells us, then we got to trust their opinion, because we are education professionals. We live in different worlds. All right. Deaf blindness, again, another one that needs to be confirmed by a medical professional, but also not one that anybody else is trying to usually confirm. Deaf blindness is concomitant, which also means comorbid, which also means more than one, dually together, dually paired diagnosis that includes hearing and visual impairment. It's a combination that it's very low populated within the special education world. One of what we would call a low incidence disability, as we don't see an incidence of deaf blindness as often as we do autism. And autism used to be a low incidence disability. It's kind of in the middle now. But deaf blindness is a very unique one in that both are present in the child, but also both are present and have a significant impact in that student's development and that student's ability to function within an academic setting. So deaf blindness. Then we have just deafness. The important thing to know is that that hearing impairment has to be so severe, which is why I bolded those words, that it impacts that student's ability to function within the academic setting. Functioning in the academic setting is really the key words that we need to know about when just understanding whether or not a child that has a disability is eligible for services. Deafness can have significant impacts on a student's receptive information, what they're hearing, what they're gaining, if they're only hearing and gaining parts of what is being lectured or educated on. There are schools devoted to deaf populations for K-12 and also universities and colleges. The deaf community is also a very big and vibrant community. They function very separately than they do in the world of special education. And so if a student who is deaf is receiving special education services, we must have an understanding that students' hearing impairment is significant enough for them to be within this setting. What you may often find is that the student is moved to a setting that's a little bit more specialized. Not always, but usually, sometimes, if possible. All right, we have emotional disturbance. You may also see this one referred to as ED, so emotional disturbance, or sometimes EBD as emotional behavior disorder. I don't love the term disorder in terms of and related to this, but it is a commonly used word as well. So emotional disturbance, ED, is a condition that exists over a period of time and is really related to a student's behavior. It's an inability to learn because of something that is causing behavioral issues, and those behavioral issues are tied to that student's emotional disturbance or emotional needs. There are two kinds of types generally that are thought of when we look at ED behaviors or students with ED. The first being inactive emotional responses. So depression, anxiety, or mood swings, bipolar disorders can be so significant for a student that it really affects their ability to learn. And it has really nothing else to do with their intellectual need or other health factors. Another marker for an ED disability would be an inability to maintain or build at all any interpersonal relationships with same age peers, with teachers. So the second type would be more of an active behavioral response from students, your students who are acting out, who hit, who get into fights, who bite, who hurt themselves sometimes, whose behaviors are very outward, as opposed to students whose behaviors are very inward. This is more often what we know and what we see as for a student with an ED diagnosis through IDEA is those who are exhibiting a lot of those outward behaviors. Often students who have those inactive behaviors, however significant they may be, are far less likely to become diagnosed with an ED disability and receive services for an ED disability because they are internalized. The student causing chaos and the stress, and that's what we think of as our student with an ED who has more outside behaviors. Youth or individuals with schizophrenia are also included into the ED world. This term is not at all just for children who are socially maladjusted. We have to remember that there's so much more to do with emotional, right? Emotion doesn't just mean one emotion, and that emotion being anger. Emotion can have many different places, but the point being that it impacts a student's ability to learn because there's a lot of other factors happening that need to be addressed first. All right, next we have hearing impairment. It's kind of on a scale. We have some individuals who have slight hearing impairment needs and some who have very significant hearing impairment needs. We have friends who have hearing aids. We have friends who have hurt their eardrums for X amount of time because they were in a sports injury. So this could be a permanent hearing impairment. It could be a fluctuating hearing impairment. It could be a hearing impairment that you've had since birth, or it could be one that's gained in over time because of multitude of reasons. So this one is a little bit different. It is not included in the definition of deafness because deafness is assuming that the student is deaf to the degree that is considered deaf, though that is a whole other kind of sliding scale. All right, next we have an intellectual disability. Intellectual disabilities were formerly referred to as mental retardation. We do not use that word anymore. That is probably the last time you will ever hear me say that word because I don't like it. But the reason we don't use the previous terminology is because of social evolution of the use of the word. I would probably just refer to it as the R word if I have to from now on. So an intellectual disability means significantly sub-average intellectual functioning. Previously, and almost exclusively in the past, IQ tests were used to diagnose or identify an individual with an intellectual disability. However, we have definitely learned that IQ tests are very flawed. And because they are so flawed as processes go, we are now looking at other ways to identify an intellectual disability, sometimes coupled with an IQ test to confirm or to provide context or to provide additional proof and support. So, but it refers to a student whose intellectual and cognitive functioning is lower or than their age or grade group expectancy. Students with an intellectual disability may be taught within their general education setting, and that's wonderful if possible and provided as many supports as they need. So you may not know which students have which disabilities within any traditional classroom in school, but if a student's disability in this area is so significant and they are not accessing any of the education that's happening within the traditional general education classroom, regardless of the number of services given in that setting, then they are more likely to be moved to a separated classroom for however long is most appropriate to that individual. And then in those classrooms, you will likely find students with significant autism, significant intellectual disability, and other disabilities that are much more high needs than others. So next we have multiple disabilities. Multiple disabilities is a very interesting one in that it is a combination of a student having more than one disability. And of course that can happen. And it's not unusual at all to have students with comorbid disabilities or concomitant impairments. You may also find a student who has a hearing impairment and also has an other health impairment, meaning more likely ADHD. And those could be completely supported within the general education setting and may not really need too many services, but they'll still be labeled as a student with a multiple disability. And then within these students' paperwork, which we'll go over all that terminology in the coming weeks as well, you will see multiple disabilities being like primary category. And then when you read a little bit further, you'll find out which are included within that multiple disabilities. More likely, they are limited to two. Of course, a student may have more than those two, but they are almost always limited to two. In some states, they'll refer to it as a primary and a secondary disability. Sometimes that means that one is more emphasized or more significant than the other, but other times not so much. It just depends, to be perfectly honest, just really depends. All right, so let's move on. We have an orthopedic impairment. Orthopedic impairments, very interesting one, because sometimes people think that this just refers to a foot. It's not. It's more thinking of a physical disability that has significant impact on a child's education performance. Again, they all have to have significant impact on the performance, but often you will find that if a student has an orthopedic impairment listed in their IEP, they are more likely to also have multiple disabilities listed as well. Usually because an orthopedic impairment alone is not a reason to receive full special education services. So let's say we have a youth with cerebral palsy who can function in the academic setting just fine, but because of their physical needs, may need access to elevators, may need more time to get to class, may need just different accommodations. Those can be provided through something called the 504 plan, which is again something we'll look at in the future, but it doesn't mean that they need full special education services. However, a different youth who also has cerebral palsy but has significant impacts to their education and that must be supported with multiple services and supports that need to be in the classroom and in any setting that they are taught in, because that's what they need to learn, then that student would be considered eligible for special education services. Again, another one that we would consider to be low incidence because it doesn't happen or doesn't come across us that often, but because it has a medical diagnosis, we don't tend to find it very rarely. The next one is an other health impairment, or sometimes or more often you will see it called an OHI, other health impairment. Other health impairments are sometimes referred to as a catch-all category because when we don't know what somebody's specific need is, or we don't have a name, or we can't really always tell you what that name is, but we know it's not intellectual and we know it's not emotional, and it has something to do with the student's health, then we throw into the category of other health impairment. More often than not, students within the OHI sphere have ADD or ADHD, so attention deficit disorder, ADD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. We know these terms in society just very well because it's a very highly diagnosed disability. But just because an individual may have either of these does not mean that they are eligible for special education services. That their needs must be severe enough in this health world for them to have been impacted in their education setting and then require supports to function within their education setting. That is when we provide services. Some other examples of health impairments that are in the OHI category include asthma, diabetes, leukemia, sickle cell, many different things. Just because, again, like I said, a youth has diabetes should not be the thing that stops you from learning. However, your needs in supporting and caring for your diabetes may have significant impacts on your ability to be in the classroom, your ability to function in the classroom. You may require different kinds of accommodations and supports, but those have to all be kind of rolled into one. All right, next we have specific learning disability, or SLD. Specific learning disability is the most common category under IDEA, meaning that the most amount of students who are served in IDEA have this disability diagnosis. It's in 2018-2019 school year, it was around 33% of all students. All students is inclusive of 7 million students across the country who receive special education services. So whatever 33% of 7 million is how many kids have a SLD diagnosis. SLD is another catch-all term to tell us that a student has issues learning or needs learning that have not been attributed to health issues, that have not been attributed to intellectual issues, that are not attributed to emotional issues. Those being the other big bucket categories, right? And it's not autism. When you can cross it out, you kind of look other places. However, this student's learning needs are significant enough that we understand that there's something perfect or imprecise about the way that they are listening, like listening comprehension, thinking or processing information, speaking, reading, writing, spelling, or being able to do any math work. So many different reasons why this could happen. The most known and cited within SLD category would be dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, because those are really, I don't know if popular, but well-known terms. And so those are the ones we know most, but a student can have none of those and still have issues in any of these areas. The way that SLD is diagnosed can vary so widely. There's a big push to something we're going to talk about them in coming weeks called response to intervention, where in order to diagnose students, where if students are not responding to any type of intervention or supports placed within their setting that are meant to help them learn, and they're not responding and they're still performing poorly in any of the areas of concern, and they continue after numerous attempts to try different things, then we are more likely to find that a student does have an SLD and does require services because they haven't responded to anything that's like supposed to be helping and could feasibly help any other child that's having a hard time in those areas. That's a big one. It's a complicated one. All right, next we have speech language impairment. Sometimes you will see this referred to as just speech language, speech lang, or SLI. And speech language impairment is a communication disorder, as the term speech or language will imply. It can include stuttering, but the stuttering must be significant. It can definitely include impaired articulation, as in a student is or an individual is trying to communicate and it cannot be understood by others. That would be the articulation part. Language impairment, very similar in the sense that it has to be understood. Voice impairment, a lot of this has to do with however the student is trying to communicate, whatever their intent is, or if they believe themselves to be communicating very well. If no one else or the majority of people or the people whom they interact with regularly cannot understand them, then there is something happening, something wrong, or not wrong, but something that needs to be addressed and something that needs to be supported. A lot of speech language is very interesting. It's not like the most common disability category, but it's not uncommon either. It's somewhere in that middle range. But what you will find is that many students with a disability, regardless of what the disability is, will receive speech language services across the country, because articulation and speech is a big task for anybody and takes a long time. But they may not be diagnosed as having a sole impairment, but they may have needs in speech language. It's a very interesting intersect. The diagnoses for a speech language impairment must come from either a medical professional or a speech language professional. Speech language pathologists can work within school settings. And at my personal opinion, every single speech language path I've ever worked with is like the best person I've ever worked with as well. And so our world intersects so much. They understand so many of the things we do. And they teach us so many of the things that they do that are pertinent to all of our students. It's a really wonderful field and really great people in general to work with if you're in that setting. Okay, second to last, we have traumatic brain injuries, or TBIs. TBIs are super interesting for lots of different reasons. TBIs are, I don't know if common is the right word, but they are known outside of special education because they can happen to any individual at any point in their lives, which is also kind of scary. So TBIs are traumatic brain injuries that someone incurs, usually through an outside force, like an accident happened or the individual was hurt or impacted in some way. And that whatever the situation may have been that caused injury to the brain had to be significant enough to change the way the student is accessing or performing in the educational world. So a TBI could include somebody who got in a car crash. It could be a minor car crash and kind of felt their brain jiggle, and it kind of knocked them for a loop for a while, for a couple of weeks. It does not have to be permanent, but it could have significantly impacted that student for a while. However, short-term TBIs, like concussions and things like that, are not usually going to be reason enough, or very rarely reason enough, to have somebody qualify for services, especially if that's expected to make a recovery from them. But you could have somebody who sustained very significant or maybe multiple TBIs, and that very significant or multiple number of occurrences really impacted the way that the individual is learning or processing or functioning. And because of that, then they would be eligible for services. It's case by case almost entirely for this diagnosis area. And it's very just wide ranging. The ones that we think of the most are sports players who sustain a lot of injuries to the head, like football players, like boxers or UFC fighters. They sustain quite a number of injuries to the head. And as we know, just through popular media, those who do and do not receive services or help from medical professionals for their injuries in this area may have significant long-lasting impact on their speech, on their cognitive functioning, their memory, their attention, their ability to function and work and move and do all these things that they could previously do and do so well before, could be significantly impacted. You may also have individuals who have had TBIs from birth or from early first days of life. It varies so widely. So case by case definitely needs to be confirmed by a medical professional. And our very last disability category is visual impairment, which includes blindness. Visual impairment is, again, kind of sliding scale, but it does not encompass people whose visual impairment only requires the use of like glasses. So a visual impairment, again, has to have a significant impact on the student's educational performance. It could include partial blindness or partial sight or full, all the way up to full blindness. So again, like I said, just because you are an individual who requires, like myself, glasses or contacts or corrective lenses to see does not mean we are eligible for special education services. Even if before we didn't have those glasses or contacts or lenses, we were not performing well because we couldn't see the board and we could barely see what was happening. And we just recognized the colors of our friends. They're generally blurry colors that we know. That is remedied through the use of those corrective lenses. And because it could be remedied through those use of corrective lenses, you're not eligible for services. However, if the individual has significant visual impairments that even through the use of corrective lenses still has impacts on their ability to function and learn and perform in the educational setting, then they would be eligible for special education services. Again, this is one that we would call a low incidence population. We don't know this to be a high number of students served in special education. Again, does not mean that they don't, but there are also sometimes designated programs in a state or in a district or a large district, usually not small districts, but large districts will have visual impairment programs, or will have visual impairment schools, or just completely different specialized settings, because visual impairments are different to accommodate, just like hearing impairments and deafness are very different to accommodate than would be a student who has a generalized learning disability. So all right, everybody, those are our 13 categories. As I said at the beginning of this video, this is a big overview. Every single one of these categories deserves so much attention. I hope it provided you some good background information.